Hello, good evening. It is April 20th, 2020, and I'm coming to you from Greeley, Colorado. I've got something on my mind that is bothering me. I started working on an article this morning, and then I just didn't have time to finish it up before I needed to go to work. So here I am, the end of the day. I'm tired and I'm not really feeling like finishing the article just yet. I am going to finish it, and once it's done, I'm going to publish it at On the Rocks blog. You can find it at onthe.rocks, and that's that. But in the meantime, I wanted to respond to a series of links that were sent to me by my neighbor 2 houses down, JP Chavez, regarding an article in Harvard Magazine that was just recently published in their May to June 2020 issue by an Aaron O'Donnell. And the title of the article is The Risks of Homeschooling. So that was one of the two links that JP just recently sent me. The other one was a page on Harvard Law School's website advertising and describing a homeschooling summit that's coming up here in June of this year called Problems, Politics, and Prospects for Reform. So it's the Homeschooling Summit, Problems, Politics, and Prospects for Reform. And between these two, it has become apparent to me that Harvard is not a big fan of public education. Oh wait, no, I'm sorry. They're not a fan of home education. Um, it's odd to me, Harvard being kind of this bastion of academic excellence in America and one of the most prominent universities in the world, that they're tackling home education. That's the really big problem that they feel like they need to press on. Now, maybe they address problems in public education all the time, and I just don't take notice because it's like, oh, the grass is green and the sky is blue, and there are problems with the public education system. I don't really follow that field as closely, or I'm not as sensitive to it as I am what appears to be an attack on home education in America. And what I mean by that is if you read the article in Harvard Magazine regarding the risks of homeschooling, it's just chock full of insinuations about homeschooling families, homeschooled children, and this, what do you want to call it, irresponsibility of states and local governments and the federal government to sufficiently, strictly enough regulate home education. As you scroll down through there's all of this character assassination that slips into what this lady has to say. And Elizabeth Bartlett, I wasn't familiar with her prior to this coming up, but apparently she's the one spearheading the homeschooling summit at Harvard, and she's the one being mostly talked about and referred to in this article in Harvard Magazine by Aaron O'Donnell. So apparently Harvard thinks that she is somebody trustworthy and credible on this. But if you look at, what is it that she's concerned about? She's concerned about parents in America homeschooling their kids while conservatives, while Christians, while being in a displeased opt-out mindset towards popular culture and, quite honestly, the way that the public schools are and have been for decades educating America's youth. It seems like it's kind of part and parcel of home education that, as a parent, I disapprove of the way that the public schools are handling education. And yet, if that's going to be used as the reason why it's somehow untoward and inappropriate for me to educate my own children at home, it's like, well, then you're not really making a convincing argument. You're making a self reinforcing circular reasoning sort of claim there, which is just that you don't like being disagreed with. I find it ironic that the very first quote that's highlighted in the piece is, children should grow up, and this is a quote, right? Grow up exposed to democratic values, ideas about non-discrimination, and tolerance of other people's viewpoints. And what the author and this professor at Harvard think that means is that homeschooling is bad because homeschool parents and homeschool children are being given the freedom to discriminate, right? To discriminate against progressive ideology, discriminate against the way that mainstream American culture has taken shape from public education's influence on America's children. So they see that as bad, right? The irony and the lack of self-awareness is astounding, where even as they're decrying homeschooling parents in America for being supposedly discriminating and intolerant of other people's viewpoints, Harvard is, by standing behind this and calling a summit and promoting it and writing it up in their magazine and publishing this, they're being remarkably intolerant of and discriminating against a different viewpoint. And what I mean by that is they want to maintain a monopoly on childhood education in America, right? And what's ironic about it is they don't see themselves as being on any kind of a level playing field, right? That idea is just utterly detestable and offensive to them at their core, which is, that's part of what it is that they are elitists. They are elitist because they like thinking of themselves as better than other people, as better than you and better than me, because they've got more degrees than Fahrenheit, and they're just smarter than us, right? They're just in this godlike level of understanding of the way that the universe works that we could never hope to even fathom, and so we should just not question, right? They don't see themselves as having to play by the rules that they want to impose on everybody else. And it gives, I think, and forgive me if I'm overstepping here and psychoanalyzing without a license, but it seems to me like they get this thrill, right, out of feeling this power over American society. And what they don't like about homeschooling, it's not that parents are educating their own children, it's that more and more parents are educating their own children, right? It's becoming increasingly popular. And I find the timing of this, and I wrote a little piece on this after I saw the Homeschool Legal Defense website advertising or I guess raising the alarm that Harvard Summit to discuss regulating homeschooling, this page by Darren Jones on March 24th. I got a hold of it about 2 days after it was published. What I said when I shared it to Facebook was that the timing of this matching up with coronavirus and schools being shut down for the year and kids being forced to stay home with their parents and work, and work on their schoolwork and their studies from home and do remote learning. I think that the academic elite in America who enjoy feeling superior morally and intellectually and spiritually, they think, to everybody else, they're terrified of a whole lot of American parents who have felt like, oh no, I could never homeschool my kids. And I've heard so many times as a homeschooling kid myself, kindergarten through up to my senior year of high school, and as now the husband of a woman who is homeschooling my children, as a homeschooling father of 7, I hear it all the time when I'm talking with people. I don't feel like I could ever homeschool my kids, right? Or my husband just doesn't, he doesn't feel like, that's a good idea. He doesn't feel like we're up to it. Or my wife, she doesn't feel like she could ever do that. Well, my wife has brought up a great point, and my wife, she went to public school all the way up. And this is something we discussed when we were dating, and then we were engaged, and then early in our marriage, and we were discussing how do we want to educate our own children, how do we want to raise our own children, if and when we have children. My wife's comment on this, because she's heard it a great many times as well, is what does it say about the nature of or the quality of public education in America if so many moms and dads in the U.S. who themselves went to public education for their K through 12, now that their parents don't feel like they could teach their own children how to read, don't feel like they could teach their own children how to do math, don't feel like they could teach their own children history and science, and not to offend anybody who was public schooled growing up, who sends their kids to public school. I really don't want to insult anybody. But if you are one of those who has always thought, man, I really wish that we could homeschool, but I just don't feel like I know enough to be able to teach my own kids at home, what does that say about the education that you received yourself? That you don't feel like you learned those subjects well enough to be able to teach your own children. I, for one, looking at this just the opposite, as somebody who was homeschooled himself, it's not that I got a perfect education, it's not that my parents were perfect, it's not like they did everything exactly 100% the way that we do things, but as a result of having been homeschooled and then interacting with a society that predominantly is the product of public education in America, as the grandson of my mother's mother, my maternal grandmother, she was a public school teacher for 30 years in Florida and was nationally recognized. My one uncle has been an educator for decades, nationally recognized, received an award from First Lady Bush for his incredible work teaching classes of kids that would come through about marine biology on the edge of the Everglades. As somebody who was homeschooled, when my wife and we were talking about how do we want to educate our own children, it was easy for me to say, we can do it. Right? I mean, where there's a will, there's a way. And it's not some arcane, Jedi mind trick where you're either born with these force powers to be able to educate your own children or you're out of luck, right? There are basic principles to education which, if you love your child and you care about them and you want them to succeed and you work at it, you can figure it out, right? And that's what I hate about this Harvard piece. is it seems to me as though it's designed not even necessarily to change the legislation regarding homeschooling, not even necessarily to outlaw it, although that's something that they float, right? The summit is supposedly going to be talking very seriously about how dangerous it is that homeschooling is not more tightly regulated in America. What are we going to do about this? Well, how about you mind your own damned business, for starters? How about you figure out what you're going to do about public education? Fix that. Because academically, for decades and decades, it has been the case that on average, homeschooled students perform 20 points higher, right? Their median scores are way higher than their public education peers, right? Now this piece, quoting Elizabeth Bartlett, this piece just sprinkles in these little character assassination nuggets, right? That, some of the kids that are being homeschooled in America, their parents are abusing them. Well, guess what? A lot of the kids that are going to public education are being abused by their parents. That's not great, right? That's also not really a point against home education or public education, right? If you're going to paint with a broad brush on homeschooling, if you're going to be intellectually honest and you don't just have an axe to grind here, if this isn't just some vendetta and you trying to virtue signal to everybody and look so superior, then you've got to apply an equally stringent standard to all education systems in order for us to evaluate them in relation to one another. But see, that's not what this piece does, right? This piece doesn't say, here's how homeschoolers do, here's how public schoolers do, right? It doesn't say, here's how they perform, here's how they perform. Now, judge the fruit and decide how you want to educate your children or how you want to advocate one way or the other. It just sprinkles in insinuations to make homeschooling look dangerous and controversial and dark and sinister, right? It's a threat to our democracy. It's even in there that because supposedly so many homeschooling parents in America are conservative Christians, that we are sabotaging the future of our country because this is illiberal, that these parents are allowed to indoctrinate their children. Well, wait a second. Okay, time out. Rewind. Let's go back to the abuse piece for a second. What if I, as a parent, am saying story after story in the news about student-teacher sexual activity, right? Teachers losing their job, or sometimes not even being arrested and tried and convicted, just being let go because things just were weird, right? There were allegations, there were things that just didn't smell right, and rather than the school district really digging into it, they just release that teacher and they don't put it in their permanent record and they don't make sure they can never get another job working with children again. They just pass them around from district to district. Absolutely happened in eastern Montana. Heard about it, multiple sources. And then finally, at the very last school, something goes over the edge or at least gets found out. Maybe it was going over the edge for a long time before it got found out. And then you start to see things unravel. And it's like, well, why didn't anybody do something about this a lot sooner? Well, the reason nothing was done about it is because the public school system was trying to protect its own. It was trying to protect its image. It was trying to protect its funding. It was trying to it was trying to preserve its status quo as being this somehow more trustworthy place to send your children. That doesn't make a damned bit of sense. And really, it does come down to a large extent, but not totally, because there are plenty of people all throughout the political spectrum and people of every kind of religious persuasion who homeschool their children. But particularly as conservative Americans who believe in liberty and who are opposed in principle to the government taking undue control of our lives and undue responsibility for making our decisions for us and taking care of us and all that, particularly for conservative Americans, we don't think of those who are in positions of government authority and influence as somehow being the pure ones by default, right? Progressives, by contrast, typically in at least their political rhetoric, will talk about corporations as being motivated by greed and just keeping the little man down and disenfranchising people. And yet, if you give way more power to a bureaucrat somewhere or to an elected official, or if that elected official gives them self-power once they're elected, and they've got way more power than any corporation in their state or county or city ever could, somehow that person isn't to be questioned. That person isn't to be distrusted, right? Why, right? The same goes for education. If you're going to say that some parents are abusing their kids and therefore homeschooling needs to be painted with this broad brush, like all of these homeschool kids are maybe being abused, well, how would you feel if we started talking about public education that way? Because you know that, and this is not conjecture, this is not theory, this is not imagination, it's not fantasy. You know that kids get abused in the public education system. They do. Does that mean that all public school teachers and administrators and coaches and principals and et cetera, that they're all abusing children? No, it doesn't. I've got a lot of friends and family who are either currently public school teachers or former public school teachers, and almost without exception, I think that they are wonderful people who are very genuine, and even if we might disagree on some things where education is concerned, I still have a lot of respect for them. But that doesn't mean, on the flip side either, that just because you know some fantastic hero of a teacher, that the system itself is unquestionable, that you can't criticize it, that you can't disagree with it, right? Something broke down in our country when we started to associate disagreeing with somebody with hating them, with doing violence to them, right? The point at which we started to believe that and started to think like that and started to interact with one another like that and interact with the issues like that, that was the point at which we began to die politically and culturally. The polarization in this country along the political spectrum and in every little pocket issue that we call politics, that polarization wherein person A can't hold a contrary view to person B and them still be friends, is so toxic. And unfortunately, Harvard, as it's presenting itself as some kind of a liberal bastion, right? We need to be the caretakers of education because we're going to teach your children to be liberal and open-minded and tolerant and all this. Even as they're promoting themselves in that light, they are being as illiberal as can be and really setting themselves up as the ultimate judge of what you get to do as a parent, what your children have available for them. I mean, at the end of this article, it's basically proposed that homeschooling should either be outlawed or it should be a default position of no, you cannot without permission across all the states. It's painted as this bad thing that in some states, the default position is you as the parent are responsible for your child. They're your child. They're not the government's child. They're not the state's child. They're not the public education's child, to where you have to ask permission to have your child, to teach your child, and then they're going to check up on you all the time to make sure you're doing it exactly the way that they wanted you to do it. Well, I'm sorry, back up a second. What was exactly the point of me opting my family out of, opting my children out of the public education system if you guys then are going to insist on telling me how I've got to educate my children? And it's like, you're playing a game of heads I win, tails you lose. And you're being a control freak, which is not liberal. That is not in a classical sense. It's very progressive, it's very Marxist, it's very centralized planning, but it's un-American. It just flat is. And for whatever somebody wants to say about the history of education in America, and point back to the Puritans or point back to, instances early in our country's history where you had some form of local community school, you had influential people in our history who were promoting education and literacy and all that. We do not have the education system that those people envisioned. And I'll give you just the example of the Bibles and prayer being taken out of public schools in recent decades, right? If this were the vision that the founding fathers and everybody that passed the baton down to us, if this was the vision that they had in mind, then why were Bibles and prayer taken out of public schools only a few decades ago? And why did a lot of social ills and why did a lot of danger sign statistics in society start to increase at a rapid growth rate year over year from when our education system changed so fundamentally to become godless, right? Harvard and Professor Bartlett might say that's really a scary thing. And even the picture that they've got here, they've got this child who's locked in a house made of books, and that's supposed to represent homeschooling. And the books, you can see the binding covers on the one side, the one wall of the house. It says Bible, arithmetic. They spelled arithmetic wrong, by the way. Writing and reading. And then there's a book that's, the roof of the house. And this child it looks like she's in prison because there's bars on the windows. I don't know if that's to keep her in or to keep the public school kids out or what, but you've got all these kids that are running around and they're playing. They look happy and peaceful and tranquil and so liberal, right? And they're just free and they're just running around without a care in the world on the outside of this house made of books, which is supposed to signify the homeschooler. And I loved it because I scrolled down through the comments on this, and I'm looking at comment after comment after comment with hundreds of likes and upvotes on each one, talking about how if this was a picture that was supposed to cast aspersions on homeschooling, like the homeschooler's the one locked in this prison all day, while the public schoolers get to just have all this freedom and just run around and play and just be, happy-go-lucky. If you were trying to illustrate that, you actually illustrated just the opposite situation. The kid who's locked in the prison is the public school kid who's told when they have to be there, when they have to go to this class, when they have to go to that class, when they can go use the restroom, when they can get up and stretch their legs, when they can move on to the next subject after they've finished that one, when they can ask a question, when they can engage the teacher because the teacher's working with 30 other kids or whatever. There's so many things that are so much more restrictive in public schools. By default, that's the entire system. to a T. And if you wanted to know about it, you can read it in my book. I'm writing a book about homeschooling. It's called "And This Is Why We Homeschool," and I'm going to get into the history, a little bit of the history of American public education system. We actually got it from the Prussian model. Frederick the Great wanted a nation of people who would make good soldiers that obeyed orders when he was fighting with other European powers and trying to establish Prussia as a dominant force in the middle of Europe. He and his father, they wanted to have good, obedient subjects in the factories, people that were going to show up and be punctual. And so they made this little factory education system where you mass produce good, loyal, obedient, submissive, servile citizens. Subjects, actually. Subjects more than citizens. The idea of taking personal ownership, of taking responsibility for your own education, for your own learning, for your own life, for your own children, that is what America was built on. And yet at a certain point in our history, roughly 100 years ago, our country took a turn right around the time of the Great Depression and the Spanish flu, if you want to know the truth, which is concerning as we go into probably another depression here as a result of an overreaction, way too much centralized thinking and planning and decision-making regarding coronavirus. Excessive reliance on the experts to tell us every last move to make, when to breathe in, when to breathe out, when to blink, when to go to the store, when to stay home, when to do whatever, when to live, when to have a job, right? Do you need a job? Are you essential? Well, I felt pretty essential. My family thinks that I'm pretty essential. My family thinks that me bringing home a paycheck with which we buy groceries and pay the rent or the mortgage or the car payment or, my family thought that that was really essential. But I guess if I'm not essential according to some bureaucrat who just arbitrarily decided who gets to go to work still and who doesn't, okay, right? Like I was conditioned to show up on time and to go home when I was told to and speak when spoken to and not make waves. That's what the public education system was originally, as we have it, designed in Prussia to do. And the progressives, John Dewey and company, they thought, well, hey, we can take that and we can just use it to promote Americanism and progressivism here in the U.S. We won't use it quite the same way that Frederick the Great and his people, his successors used it, that arguably led to Nazi Germany and a Germany that was passive and complicit in the Third Reich and all that. We'll use it to accomplish the melting pot. We get all these immigrants coming in from all over the country, from all these different places, and we will use this model of education to get everybody submitted to Americanism. What they failed to realize and to appreciate was that these people had come to America from all of these places because they wanted to be free, right? That was the idea. So then when Harvard or anybody else tries to suggest that the real essence of Americanism is that we need to not be free. We need somebody telling us and our children and conditioning our children from very early on to be told every last little step to take. And as parents, for us to be told, you're not qualified. If you push back, we're going to assassinate your character. We're going to suggest that you're racist, misogynistic, homophobic, bigoted, ignorant. You don't have a teaching degree, so how could you possibly be qualified to teach your own children? You're going to mess them up. You're abusing your child. Whoa. And they're just going to ratchet it up until you say uncle, or until you say, hey, wait a second. Let's think about that, right? Let's pause here for a second and consider what it is that you're actually saying. And is that true? And does that make sense? At first I was afraid. I was petrified. First I was angry, actually, when I read this Harvard article, and I read about the Homeschooling Summit, Problems, Politics, and Prospects for Reform, and I read the HSLDA Harvard Summit to discuss regulating homeschooling. At first, it really bothered me. It made me really anxious because it's like, these people are going to exploit this current crisis to push through, ram through a whole bunch of tight restrictions on homeschoolers as if we're the problem, right? And then I realized, wait a second, they are panicking because all of these parents in America who were borderline, who were concerned about teen pregnancy and teen suicide and peer pressure and bullying and low academic performance and a generally bad experience with American public schools. All of those parents who didn't feel like they were competent to teach their own child. All of those parents who felt like I could never do a decent job, if all of a sudden for the remainder of the school year they've got their kids and they're having to help their kids with their homework and they're having to be diligent, not all of them to a man, of course, right? But what if we go from 3-4% of American children being homeschooled to 6-7-8%, right? What if it goes to 10%? What if it goes to, and what if, in combination with American parents pushing for charter schools and going to homeschooling, the American government loses its monopoly on childhood education, right? Because that's what it is, right? The government taking over education gives it a monopoly. And for all the same reason that a monopoly is bad in the private sector, it's even worse in the public sector. When the government has the monopoly, not only are you out of options, but they can twist your arm and say, by golly, you're going to do this, or else we will make you pay. We will threaten you. We will ratchet things up until you give in. And so seeing this coming down the pike, I'm some mixture of concerned and also amused, because it's like these people are feeling a little bit of power slipping away, and they're thinking, what if these parents all of a sudden realize, hey, I could do this. I could homeschool my kid. I am ready to try it next school year. I am ready to do the research on what curriculum we want to use and to rearrange my schedule. And maybe I'm working from home now anyways. And let's look at that, right? Because the local public schools are getting their funding based off of how many kids they're getting enrolled, right? They're getting their funding based off of their test scores. That's the way that the game works. And I don't say game to cast aspersions on the good teachers. So if you're going to go there, just stop, right? But the way that the game works is you've got bright young kids who could be even brighter if they were homeschooled, potentially, right? If their parents feel like that's the question to answer here. And if those bright young kids are vacating, if they're exiting the public education system, their local public school, that was going to have higher test scores as a result of those kids being part of the mix, not only are they going to have lower enrollment, they're going to have lower average test scores, and that hurts in the pocketbook. That hurts in the budget. And that hurts the ego, too. I mean, unfortunately, people are people, and that goes for homeschoolers, and that goes for public schoolers. That goes for, a father of 7 kids whose wife is homeschooling, and he's homeschooling a little bit, kind of on the side, not as much, because I work 9 to 5. She stays home. I have to work. People are people. Just because you give them a title and wave a magic wand and say this person is now one of our heroes in society, that doesn't mean that they stop being human beings who have sometimes mixed motives. right? The system in and of itself, it's so easy if you're going to base your funding off of test scores. It's so easy to get sucked into, well, now we're going to teach to the test so that we can get more funding, so that then we can pour those resources into providing a better educational experience for our children, so that then they will get a better education. Well, wait a second. You kind of shot yourself in the foot, because in teaching to the test, you passed up the opportunity to inspire these children to really learn and understand and appreciate the material for itself, right? And so even when you get the funding, if you get the funding, if you play that game well and better than all the other superintendents and all the other administrators in your state or whatever, even if you play it well, once you get all of that money and you're able to buy the fancy lab and you're able to build the new fancy building and everything's just shiny and new and beautiful and impressive on the outside, if those kids and those teachers are just over it because they feel like it's a gimmick and it's not really about learning, what was the point? And the beautiful thing, by contrast, and I'll close with this, the beautiful thing is that with homeschooling, it really is what you make it. Now, that can be dark and sinister if you want to think that way, if you want to have this perverse mind that makes into villains the people that are making you feel insecure. You can make it something dark and sinister. You can also make it something fantastically beautiful. And that's just life, right? That's true of any profession, that's true of any walk of life, that's true of anything that you want to pursue. You've got to make choices, but in order to be able to make choices, you've got to be free. And in order to have freedom, we cannot have people ramming through this restrictive, narrow-minded, illiberal approach to child's education. Your child's education, my child's education. We cannot have that, because it removes our ability to make, yes, maybe some bad choices, but it doesn't even really remove that, right? Bad choices are going to be made. And maybe arguably even more bad choices are going to be made as you're frustrating children, as you're frustrating parents, as you're frustrating teachers, you're frustrating administrators. This system's broke, right? It just is. Like, look at the stats, look at what it's churning out. Not to a man, there's some fantastic people. My wife came out of public education. There's some fantastic people that have. But the system in general, if you're gonna do a comparison, if Harvard wants to play that game, let's play that game. Do a comparison on the average product of a public education and home education. I don't need to apologize, but by golly, I'm also not going to sit quietly as somebody's campaigning and plotting and trying to meet together to strip me and my family of our freedom. So anyway, with that, I would encourage you, if you're a homeschooling parent, don't freak out about this. Don't get panicked. You're doing great. Your kids are way further ahead because of how much you care about their education. So keep doing your best. Keep doing a great job. If you're a parent who's thought about teaching your kids at home, research, do the reading, look into it. And don't take this garbage that, oh, you can't do that. Well, you don't have a teaching degree. Like, did you go to college and study early childhood education for 6 years, right? Like, that's not good enough, right? It might not be worthless, but it's not good enough to guarantee a child is going to get a good education. And you as the parent, if you work hard and you are diligent and you pour yourself into it, who knows better than you, your child? So figure it out, right? Be bold, be courageous. Your kid is worth it. Your family is worth it. And lastly, if somebody wants to make the argument, our democracy is on the line, our country is worth it, right? We do our nation a great service if we are raising our children to be intelligent, and self-teaching and self-motivated and disciplined and curious and enthusiastic and hardworking and motivated and to not take no for an answer. We do not do our country a service if we are pompous asses who want to talk down our noses to other people and make them feel small. We are shooting ourselves in the foot as far as our community goes. We are sabotaging our greater good, ironically, by pushing for this collectivism bullshit. So, sorry. But it is. I mean, it is. So I will say this. Do your research. If you're on the fence, you're undecided, really look at what would it take to make it work. And if you're somebody who's part of this push to disparage home education, I'd really encourage you to consider your motives. Why? Right? Why do you have an axe to grind with home education? Is it because it's genuinely this boogie monster, or is it because it makes you feel insecure? You feel your power, your importance, your position is eroded by home education winning out. Don't squash your competition for reasons like that, because I guarantee you're not just hurting the homeschooling families, you're not just doing them a disservice, you're not just bearing false witness against your neighbor by treating them that way, referring to them that way. You're hurting yourself, right? Anyway, with that, that's all I'm going to say. Pardon the language. I should have given a trigger warning, apparently. Look out for my article. I'm going to finish it up tomorrow, get it published. But for now, thanks for watching. Have a good night.